I wanted to talk about the question of whether taxation is theft today. I think it's a fascinating question, and it's a very important question because taxes are the basis of almost any government, and it's something that I think everybody needs to consider at some point in their lives if this is actually an ethical system that we're in, because the old analogy is a fish doesn't know it's swimming in water. You might not see that you're surrounded by an unethical system because it's just so prevalent and everyone just accepts it. Now, let me tell you where my sympathies lie before I get going. I would rather live in a society where the majority of citizens did believe taxation was theft, as opposed to the majority of citizens simply didn't even consider the question or believed taxation was always ethical. So I'm definitely sympathetic to the libertarian side of this question, but my quick answer, if you want to know if taxation is theft, is no. Is it always unethical? Is probably the more precise question, and my answer to that is it's complicated. It can be incredibly unethical. Let's get that clear. And it can act on a wide spectrum, and it can actually, I think, reach a point where it, if not is ethical, then it can reach a point where it does as little harm as possible. So we'll get more into that difference towards the end of this. So the reason I say it's not theft, let me quickly address the main argument here. That's a simplistic one, but the main argument is you're taking people's money, and they may or may not consent to it. Let's just assume this person doesn't consent to it. How is that not theft? It's a very straightforward, example. I want your money. I'm going to do something with it that's irrelevant, and you don't want to give it to me. And if you don't give it to me, I'm going to use the power of the state and guns and police and all this stuff to threaten you with imprisonment, and ultimately I'm going to get that money. So that's the really simplistic version of taxation as theft. Obviously, I don't want to straw man it, so somebody could probably make a much more compelling argument than that. But that's the simplest one you're likely to encounter, and it is a pretty strong argument, I think, because that's all true. A person may be reluctant to give up his money. The state says, "Give me your money," or you know you're going to suffer the consequences. It's just like a robbery, right? It really is no different, except when you consider there's a lot more going on here. It's kind of like zooming in too closely to a problem and not seeing the big picture, right? You can manipulate data this way if you just zoom in on a graph and you just show the part where the graph is going up or down, but don't show the wider trends, right? So there's a little bit of bias going on here. So obviously taxation is not theft because it's just too simple of a statement, and there's a lot more nuance going on here. So another way to approach this is to think of a racket. If you're not familiar with a racket, just recall like movies or the law, where a criminal organization, organized crime, basically a mafia, forces people to pay them protection money, right? This is a form of extortion, and it's done in a systematic way, similar to taxation. And there's a little air of legitimacy there because they're saying we're going to protect you. You're really just their tax cattle at this point. The only reason they'd protect you is they don't want other people getting your money, right? They don't want a criminal to come in and rob you because that's part of their money now. So this is kind of a false service, in a way, and of course you have no way to reject this other than force. and so what's the difference between this and a government doing it? And in some cases, there is almost no difference, right? If it's a really corrupt government, what we're looking at here is a very similar situation. Although I imagine even the most corrupt government offers at least something in terms of infrastructure, to some degree, and maybe some defense, but that's usually all in their own self-interest. It doesn't have anything to do with you. It just happens to work out slightly to your benefit. But in the best situation, it's not a racket and it's not theft, because this you're not only getting actual services that you need and perhaps want back from these taxes. It is strictly regulated by the people and the law, right? If all those things are in place, I don't think you can call it a racket. I don't think you can call it theft. At some point, it becomes far less unethical than the simple statement it's theft or a racket. The really important part here is that it is strictly controlled by the people and the law. And in some ways, I want to get into the history of taxation a little bit, but working backwards, we could talk about the American Revolution here. This was basically a war over taxes. There's obviously more to it, but one of the primary reasons, of course, was taxation without proper representation. So what does that mean exactly? It means you're forcing us to pay you money, but not only are we not getting the proper amount of services back for this money, we have very little say in the laws that regulate these taxes, right? So it starts to break down and becomes very unethical when the people have no say in the taxes. The law is not, you can't change the law because it's you have no representation in Parliament across the ocean, and you're not getting the proper services for your taxes back. So all these things add up, and it starts to become more of a racket or more like theft than a semi-legitimate tax system, right? So wars have been fought over this, and this country, in a way, was founded on taxes going awry. So that's why another reason why it's such an important question to consider, because it's almost built into this country's DNA that taxation can go wrong, and we constantly need to be on the lookout for taxation to go wrong, because it can very easily go wrong. I mean, imagine a system where you can just take people's money at will and always claim a certain moral superiority about it, right? You always have the ability to say, well, this is for your own good, and this is the right thing to do. Oh, and also we'll basically kill you if you don't do it. It's a double whammy, and it's a very exploitable system, especially if you get people in power who are only interested in power, and they're sociopaths or whatever. That's why it needs to be very carefully watched, and that's why this argument always needs to be in people's minds, and you need to carefully consider it. So real quick, let me go back and do the history of taxation to some degree to kind of get an idea of where it comes from. So when civilizations start emerging during the agricultural revolution, basically we needed a way to organize ourselves for things that we can't do individually, right? We needed much bigger groups to do things like common defense was probably the main one, but we also had a need for big projects like irrigation canals or temple building or whatever it is. And so some small group of people needed to gain most of the resources so they could properly organize them, right? It was also a way of kind of making sure everyone contributed. If you have a small group of people, it's very easy to tell who's contributing and who's not, but in a much larger society, you need some way to ensure everyone's contributing their fair share. So you can see why taxes would naturally emerge, and of course you couple that with the natural human instinct to want to be greedy and gain power, and suddenly you can say that this thing that is helping others is legitimate, even though you're gaining the most from it. So it's very similar to how all modern governments and politicians work. I don't think anyone is purely self-interested, although some people are sociopaths and probably are. But I think most politicians convince themselves that they're getting into it for the benefit of everyone, for the people. They think they have good ideas, and they want to, whether they're right or wrong about their ideas, they think they're going to make their country or the world a better place. But it just so happens that they get all this money and or power out of the situation. So the two things kind of always go together, right? Um, and in the same way, the taxes always kind of go together as a carrot and a stick to the actual citizen. It always says, um, you have to pay this or you will suffer violent consequences, but it's legitimate and you get a bunch of stuff back. So it has a kind of moral legitimacy to it that sometimes is a little more deserved than others, obviously. So there's only two ways to get money from people, right? Or to get their resources or their whatever. You either get it by force or you get it by offering them something. One is theft, one is trade. But taxes kind of combines both of these things, and that's what makes it such a prevalent, powerful institution. Um, because you're saying, give us the money, and yeah, you're going to get something from it, and it has a certain moral legitimacy because it's, in the best cases, it's something that the people, at least in general, consent to, and it's regulated by law. So that's some of the history and the context for how this thing is occurring and why it's so prevalent. Um, Now I finally want to get back and address the really the primary question again: is taxation ethical? Um, and again, it's a complicated question. As we've seen, there are certainly bad motivations for taxing people, like greed, power, self-interested motivations. But there's also a certain amount of um, altruism there, right? There's a certain amount of I want to help people, and so that's why it can get complicated. And there's obviously a spectrum of how well regulated this is, how much say do the people have in the taxes. So I think it's important to keep in mind that I think most tax systems do fall in the range of unethical because for all practical purposes, people just don't have enough say in their taxes and how they work. Um, and so you are kind of just stuck with the system that you have, and and of course the person who says taxation is theft always has this very simple argument to fall back on. I don't want to pay it. I'm being forced to pay it. That seems unethical to me. And even though they're leaving out the stuff about you're getting something back, and if it's done with your consent or the majority of people's consent and regulated, they do leave that out. But it is difficult to say it's not unethical in most situations. I would kind of use the analogy of, if you're familiar in science fiction, of a generational ship, right? So if you're just kind of born on this ship, and maybe it's not really fair that you were born on this ship. If you're not familiar, a generational ship is basically a way to reach stars over hundreds of years period. It takes a long time to reach other stars. So you basically have people who have generations born over time. Eventually, the 10th or 20th or whatever generation will reach the star. So the first people who go out on this ship are all consenting to this journey, but every one of their ancestors is not really. And that's kind of the situation we all find ourselves in. We're just kind of handed this system, and
we're in this system, and there's no way out of it. Now you could say, well, you could just leave, and that is always an interesting argument here. If you go back to the mafia racket, if the mafia comes to your business and says you have to pay us protection money, would it be ethical to say, well, that person can just leave? They don't have to consent to being extorted. They can leave. Um, the mafia, in some cases, that's probably not even true. They'll come after you, but a government, our government, at least in the United States, would let you leave. But it still doesn't seem quite right. Just because you can leave an unethical situation doesn't mean it's not unethical in the first place. So, and for all practical purposes, you can't really leave. Where are you going to go, right? Everyone has taxes, or most places have taxes, and it's just very difficult to break away from society in a practical way. But it's not impossible, and so some people can, and that is usually one of the default arguments. Hey, if you don't like it, you can leave. I don't think it's a great argument, though, because that doesn't change the underlying ethics of the situation, nor is it very practical. Um, but finally, yes, so you're on this generational ship, and you're born into this system, and it's kind of not fair. But if you're on this ship, you pretty much have to contribute. I mean, and if depending on the structure of the ship, you might have a military type structure with a captain and this kind of thing, a hierarchy, and you kind of have to get in line and contribute and help and do your duty, right? And you could see how people would naturally resent this, and there'd be all kinds of arguments like, we don't belong here. This wasn't fair. Why do I have to listen to you? I'm not free. And they would all, in a way, be right, but in another way, they're wrong, because if they don't cooperate and put the theoretical, ethical stuff aside, at least for their journey, they're all going to die. Or if enough people start questioning the system, then what are they going to do? You can't have anarchy on a ship. It just doesn't work. Now, countries aren't ships, but maybe there is an ultimate destination here where everyone does consent exactly to the degree that they want to be taxed, or maybe we get to a point where taxation becomes irrelevant by the abundance of technology. Um, but for now, we're kind of all on this journey together. So I would say, for practical purposes, keep the question in mind. Always be on the lookout for tyranny and the taxation system to be abused. It's incredibly important historically, and it will be in the future as well. But I think you kind of just need to go along with it for right now. If for no other reason, for the practical purposes of your life is going to get severely screwed up if you don't pay your taxes, obviously. Um, but for those people who choose not to, I have a lot of sympathy for them, because they usually have very strong ethical reasons for why they're not doing it. Um, Although there are just some people who just don't want to. They're just cheap, right? But I think the majority of people who don't pay their taxes have some sort of ethical problem with it. Um, so I sympathize with that, and I wish it was the case that you didn't get locked up for not paying your taxes. Maybe there could be some other consequences, bad credit or something. That doesn't seem right at all to me. But that's kind of the system we have, and so ultimately I come down on and say that taxation isn't exactly theft. It can, at the worst of it, be a racket, but at the best of it, it is only slightly unethical, to a degree that isn't warranted to throw your life away to fight it. But ultimately, in a utopia, there would be no coercion of any kind. There'd be no taxation. So that's my take on it. Thanks for listening.